from one of the articles, it's just different, in India it's just different, versus the other impulse we feel that we are the same, and that stems from the need for solidarity to kind of connect, women in the first world and women in the third world, to kind of learn from each other when such things happen, and that's well and good, but also the other impulse that we're just different. So how do we kind of reconcile this? And I think Mohanty makes that case here in several locations in her essay, about the fact it is so important just to articulate the differences, to kind of locate women in their concrete historical context and their social context. I was looking at the article very briefly right before this meeting, and she cites the example of a feminist, I think, economist perhaps, who's done a kind of, I don't know if it's anthropological work, but she goes and interviews these women lace makers in a part of India, and really just defines what exactly is that they're working with. They're defined as housewives, and their labor is therefore seen as not, worthy of the right payment because it's done in their spare time. So that kind of a location of their social location, their monetary kind of location, what they're working from, is, it specifies them, and it kind of gives them a certain agency that, yes, they're behind the veil, but they're also able to negotiate public space in a way that protects them and gives them kind of, makes them feel safe. So there's that kind of, I think, I don't know if I'm trying to do a good job articulating here, but I think being able to specify people's locations gives you the kind of theoretical tools to know what are the points of connection you can make, and what are the points of differences. So I guess in the case of Steubenville versus Delhi, you have to kind of specify that, yes, the Steubenville case is, as you were saying, it's kind of a chauvinistic way of glorifying footballers, whereas in the Indian case, it's more kind of, there's a class issue that is not really brought to the surface in a lot of the reportage about the Delhi case. It's just so, like, violent, and we're just blown away by the violence that we just cannot even step aside from it and articulate that these 6 men are from a much lower class than the woman who was raped. So there is that angle, whereas in the Steubenville case, perhaps class is not such an issue. So there is that point of difference. So it's not just different; it's different because of these reasons. What can we learn from that? How can we theorize that without doing too much violence to the specifics? Let's see. And then the second point that I thought was interesting about nationalism versus colonialism. In my work as a writer who's having to, you start writing a novel and you're about history, and you realize you have to actually be a historian almost first before you can write fiction about history. It's a funny thing, but I kind of see Indian nationalism as being in a lineage from colonialism, the British Raj. So I don't see them as very different, and certainly from the point of view of women, and again, not women as a big category, but lower class women, tribal women, and then middle class women. These different women have very different experiences of colonialism and nationalism. On the one spectrum, where you have upper class women, perhaps benefiting somewhat from nationalist policies, where they kind of get glorified as the figure of the mother that is the nation, who is pure and who is in need of protection by the male. So I mean they're glorified in that perhaps there are some benefits. Obviously there's huge problems with that kind of romanticization, that what is the verb?
Glorification.
Glorification, thank you. And then on the other spectrum, which is the spectrum which we looked at the Rise event when we talked about the tribal women, they're so on the margins. They're not even on the margins. They're like way off the chart, off the margins. And the quote from Patricia Hill Collins is so apt that the very bottom of the page, the view that used black women as the other, the mammies, matriarchs, welfare mothers, and Jezebels, who mark the boundaries of normality for American women overall. So in that sense, tribal women in India are exactly this. They are not a part of the nation. They do not see that they are together with the Indian nation, where they have a common past and a destined common future. They are actually the problem. They stand in the way of the middle class's future, this brilliant future which consists of capitalism, which consists of malls, which consists of very pricey education, and all the goodies that come with liberalization that have been trickling in and have already come, but the price that is paid to get us, the middle class in India, all these benefits, is the lives of these tribal men and women, the rape of their women, the grazing of entire villages, but these people, they're there and they're not going to go just, they're not going to disappear into ether. So they become the enemies first of the state and then of the middle class. So in that sense, they do not constitute the nation. They have been the enemies of colonial policies and now nationalist policies. So in that sense, I see nationalism, Indian nationalism, really inheriting from colonialism, not kind of, it's not like an either or, like, it's not like women have, we can pick colonialism as it was in the case in colonial times. It is, if you look at certain things that have happened in history, such as the violence that was done during partition, it wasn't such, a scene of madness as is assumed to be by a lot of historians, a lot of novelists, certainly a lot of filmmakers. It was very systematic. It was state sanctioned, and the state learned from colonial policies. One of the dictates that Pandit Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, had on his agenda was to inherit as much of colonial policies as he could. There were, I don't want to get into the specifics of that, but that's the one point that I wanted to make. Other than that, let's see. I think I'm pretty much done. I don't know if you want to open it up to discussion questions.
Yeah, can we go round of applause?
Yeah.
Are there specific questions in response to anything that the panelists talked about? Okay, this isn't like a discussion question, but could you just, define like the universalism thing? I don't think I understand it. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, looking at this, it may very well be that I'm using universalism a little bit differently, at least in the way that she talks about proof of universalism. I don't know if I'm using it.
Actually, I've never heard.
Okay, anyway, basically, the way I was using universalism was the idea that, like, you can sort of, it's the opposite of the argument of the it's just different argument. It's the idea that we can locate, like, the sort of patriarchy is a category that we can understand in any location across the world, at least in any sort of location in a modern state like India or the United States, and that we can sort of understand how it works in similar, that we can use the same tools to figure it out. And I think the statistics thing is part of that, right? It's a way in which we can count, how many rapes are reported and so on, and then we can make comparative judgments, right? I think that's what a sort of universalist approach does. One of it's a methodological thing, but also universalism is not the same as sameness, so I'm not trying to suggest that. But I think for Christoph, it's not just, I think for people like Christoph, it's also in time, not just across space, right? Because he's basically like, India is like behind the US, but it's like on the same metrics, right? On the same, we can count, like how many people in the US think that it's okay to like, physically commit physical violence on your spouse or something. How many people think so in the US versus India? Therefore, we can make we can map out how much progress we've made and how much. So that's what I understand basically as universalism, and I don't think but it's not the same as solidarity. Right?
Yeah,
it's not the
absolutely.
same as right. So this is very important.
Solidarity would have to do more with like political praxis.
Absolutely.
One thing.
Which that can be transnational. Right.
Yes. Hopefully it is.
Hopefully it is.
in all cases.
Hi. Oh, sorry. I'm Andrea. I'm a freshman at college. I'm actually thinking about writing a paper on feminism in India, and there was an article on Al Jazeera recently that talked about, it actually compared the New Delhi case with a case of a young girl who was raped in India. I was gonna look it up, like the name and stuff on my phone, but it just died. I don't know if you've heard about it, about the case, and it was kind of comparing on how like police forces and law forces have been treating the cases differently, and I was wondering if that had to do with, you mentioned like the class system having a lot to do with this case, and I don't know if that was the case for the little girl, or if there's
so
reasons.
many races,
Yeah.
sadly.
Yeah, no, it was just a specific article.
Yeah. Well, if you bring up the police, I mean, there is the case of tribal women and basically any woman who is under police arrest is just fair game. And again, like I was actually thinking about the whole logic behind it, and this is a connecting piece actually. The one thing that can connect the Steubenville case to the Delhi rape case, and more specifically actually the tribal rape cases that happen within police custody, is the logic that silence is consent. So in the case of the tribals, where they're not supposed to be heard, they don't have a voice on the national level, in the media, they're silenced. Actually, the first people who are killed among the tribals are the up-and-comers, the journalists. So this one woman, Soni Sori, who is still in arrest and was sexually assaulted by the policemen. Her nephew is actually a journalist. He went to study journalism in Delhi. He was very bright, and her connection with her nephew is what caused her to come up on the radar of her state. So in that case where you're not supposed to be heard, you're quote unquote silent. Your silence is taken as consent, so you are fair game because the media is not going to talk about you, it's not going to take your side. So that would be the connection that you can make, that why are we seen as silent when we're actually drugged and silent, as in the case of the young girl in Steubenville, versus when your voice is politically silenced.
I was just gonna
tack on to that universalism question and mention something that might be useful to like think about in addition to like universal toolkits for approaching, like, situations. I think another part that's really important about universalism and sort of feminist thought is the universal like feelings associated with these situations. So like, for example, the universal feeling of what it means to be a woman with a capital W, right? So like womanhood as some sort of like entity that you can claim and stake out as like a common experience of all women globally. Rape as an experience that you can stake out as something that every woman would feel absolutely the same. That's sort of a universalist sort of framework for thinking about, I guess, like these issues. And I think if you think about it in sort of negative terms, there's people like to juxtapose universalism with like relativism. I'm not totally sure about that dichotomy, but that's another way of thinking about universalism versus relativism.
Yeah,
But there's many different ways to think about the splits, but that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. I studied with a very famous feminist when I was at NYU, and this was the point that she always kind of made at the end. And I think the kind of thing that I started with was, it's just different. That is the kind of relativism. We have liberated women here in the first world, but their standards are different. They really, we have to respect their veils, and that, because that comes under the category of culture. And that's I think you were speaking to that women become culture. They're not just, and they become cultural commodities. So if you touch that, that's imperialism. We don't want to be imperial, so we will be relative. But when you're relative, how will solidarity happen? How will, and we shy away from, we don't want to be universal and just, club everyone together and not appreciate the differences. But we want solidarity, we want connection, and as you say, rape should be that connecting point, that all women can face this, and it's violent, and it's time to take some action on that. So.
I mean, my question actually is whether rape can be that connecting point. I think that's a really complicated question to ask. Because I'm not totally sure that rape and sexual domination can be the connecting point between all women. And I think that's like the question that might be being faced right now when we're comparing Steubenville and New Delhi.
I think one of the things we have to really look at is patriarchy. That this is where this rape and why is everything common becomes really important, is that patriarchy is, it's a foundation that is built before the nation state. So it's already thousands of years old. It's not new that way. It's that every block that has been built on patriarchy has decided it's gone with patriarchy. It's decided it can take that role, that men can continuously have that role, and matriarchy is diminished. So I think that sort of has to be our connection as women also, that we can't leave it like that. And also men can't leave it like that, because it destroys the soul for both. I mean, if men have to look at women and can decide that we can be violent against them, against women, then that already it doesn't give a very good space neither for men or for women. So I think, looking at patriarchy, we have to, because patriarchy, it's dominance against women. That is the first split that takes place in patriarchy. When patriarchy comes into being, it finishes matriarchy, or tries to take it as far as it can. Was it violent? Probably, and so the woman becomes the slave, first slave. And family is part of this, that whole slave mentality, that the patriarch is the owner of these children and these females. So there's a history that we're not opening up yet. but we need to open that history, because one of the things that females are facing, just like colonized nations are facing, is that we have no history. So so like for us Indians, it's two doubled whammies. One is imperialism says you have no history, and we've taken up liberal forms, so then we're not allowed to go into, we can't live from our own historical crib. We're in the crib of this liberalization. So we've lost one thing. Then on top of it, patriarchy already exists. So for Indian women and a lot of other colonized places, we really faced a terrible situation from both sides, from imperialism, because that denies our being. It denies our right to be. So, that's one thing we're trying to do in our organization, RISE, is to really start looking at this, because we've got to look at